Okay, welcome back to U.S. History Lecture videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Oh, look at that, I added a T to my name. There we go. So today we're going to talk about how Native Americans were affected by westward expansion. The official title of the lesson in our textbook is The Assault on American Indian Life and Culture. Okay, so by the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the methods that the U.S. government used to address the quote Indian problem during the settlement of the West and explain the United States policy of Americanization as it applied to Native peoples in the 19th century. So we're still focusing on the 19th century here, and we're going to talk specifically about how the westward expansion and this huge wave of settlers that moved west in the United States and mostly the second half of the 19th century, how that affected the Native Americans who were already living in the West. So as settlers moved westward in the 1800s, they came into conflict with Native tribes who were already living on Western land. The United States government sought to address the perceived, quote, Indian problem, and you're going to see that the government very much supported the settlers, very much discriminated against the Native Americans. And remember when we talked in previous lessons about manifest destiny and this belief that it was a God ordained mission and right to push America west, no matter the consequences, that mindset comes into play with a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So you can take a minute and just consider how it felt for the Native Americans as more and more settlers arrived on their lands. And many of them tried to trade and behave peacefully, and we're going to see there's a lot of discrimination against Native Americans here. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 is covered more thoroughly even in another lesson, but just as a reminder here, this was a forced relocation of Native American tribes that were on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, forcing them to move to the west of the Mississippi River, removing them from the lands that had been promised to them because the U.S. government wanted that land for American settlers. This resulted in the infamous Trail of Tears, where nearly 50,000 Cherokee, Seminole, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek were forcibly moved, and many thousands of them died. So this was just, I don't even want to call it the beginning, but just another round of discrimination and violence that the U.S. government legally supported and enforced against Native Americans. So moving forward through time here, as American settlers push westward, they keep coming into conflict with native tribes that had been living on the land for a long time. Although the threat of attack was fairly slim, the occasional attack was enough to fuel popular fear of the native peoples. And often the Native Americans, when they did attack, was in retaliation for being mistreated by American settlers. So these clashes, when they happened, were indeed brutal, although most of the brutality occurred at the hands of the settlers. So we're going to talk about some of the policies that the U.S. government put in place and some of the retaliations that took place. So the first Treaty of Fort Laramie took place in 1851, and it established distinct tribal borders and a reservation system for a group of Native Americans. Tribes were promised annual payments of $50,000 for 50 years, which was later reduced to 10 years, if they agreed to stay clear of settlement paths. So the government was sort of clearing the way for American settlers to take chunks of Western land. However, government corruption led to many tribes not receiving the promised payments. These tribes were forced onto land and then not provided for, and sometimes eventually retaliated due to desperation, starvation, and broken promises. Settlers continued to encroach even on reservation land. So land was promised in reservations and set aside for Native Americans and then was taken away repeatedly by the U.S. government and by American settlers as westward expansion continued to increase and American settlers took more and more and more land and the U.S. government took more and more and more land. Some tribes resisted, which led to conflicts and massacres, notably the Dakota War of 1862 in Minnesota and the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado 2 years later in 1864, which we're going to talk about. So the Dakota War in Minnesota. In 1862, the Dakota people were frustrated and angered by the lack of these annual payments that the government of the United States had promised them. They were hungry. There was not enough food. If you were confined to a specific amount of land when you have been a nomadic people following your food sources, you are going to run out of food. And they were not provided for by the US government like the US government had promised. And not only that, but the US government and settlers continued to encroach on their reservation lands. So, as a result of that, the Dakota people in Minnesota rebelled in what became known as the Dakota War, or the War of 1862, killing the white settlers who had moved onto their tribal lands. Over 1,000 white settlers were captured or killed in this attack before an armed militia regained control. Of the 400 Sioux people who were captured, 303 were sentenced to death, but President Lincoln intervened, releasing all but 38 of the men. Lincoln's government hanged the remaining 38 Dakota men in the largest mass execution in the country's history, and then the government imprisoned the other Dakota participants and banished their families from Minnesota. So, both sides, right, participating in the conflict here, but most historians argue that for the vast majority of these conflicts, Native Americans were wronged first and then tried to fight back, and then were their retaliation was pretty much crushed. All right, the second major event, the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, happened 2 years later. Again, fighting back against land encroachment. The Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes were fighting back against having more and more of their land being taken from them after it was promised to remain theirs. As a result of this, white militias formed to fight back against the Native American people and decimated even some of the tribes that were willing to cooperate. Again, not differentiating between the tribes that were threatening violence and the tribes that were trying to live peacefully. One of the more vicious examples of this was near Sand Creek, Colorado, where a colonel named John Chivington led a militia raid upon a camp in which the Cheyenne leader Black Kettle had already negotiated a peace settlement. The camp was flying the American flag and the white flag of surrender when the colonel's troops murdered close to 100 people in the camp, the majority of them women and children, and mutilated their bodies in what became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. So this is quite famous for its disturbing violence, the discrimination that's clearly at play here, right? Attacked women and children who were not participating in the war in a camp that was openly declaring that they were willing to work with Americans. And for the rest of his life, that officer, that colonel, displayed his collection of Native American scalps from that day without really repercussions. The U.S. Army condemned his tactics and the results, but the raid ultimately served as a model for some settlers who would do anything to get rid of the quote-unquote Indian threat. So, very little consequences for this massacre, and that lack of consequences, right, only encouraged people who are of like mind to do similar things. So then we get the second treaty of Fort Laramie, which moved the Lakota people to the Black Hills in Dakota Territory. The goal was to prevent further uprisings by moving the people yet again to another reservation, yet again promising that they would not trespass on the land. But this, yet again, did not stick. It was short-lived because gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and then American settlers violated the treaty, moving on to Lakota lands. So we can see Native Americans getting punished and pushed over and over again. That's going to bring us to the Battle of Little Bighorn. This is a pretty famous battle. It's considered the single greatest loss of U.S. troops to a Native American force during the era of westward expansion. Nearly 3,000 Lakota warriors surrounded and killed General George Custer and 262 of his men. So Lakota Chief Sitting Bull united the neighboring tribes to defend their lands. Again, Lakota fighting back against broken promises, and they're retaliating. They've been moved yet again. The United States says, "Well, stay off your land." Gold is discovered. The United States breaks all its rules, and now the Lakota are trying to fight back. General George Custer attacked what he thought was a small encampment, only to find that the Lakota Chief Sitting Bull had united multiple tribes, and there were over 3,000 various Native American warriors there who defeated Custer's forces. Unfortunately, again, the American retaliation for this was terrible, but it is considered the single greatest loss of U.S. troops during this time period to Native Americans. But despite the victory, Native resistance ultimately failed to stop American expansion. The U.S. Army just kept arriving in greater numbers, and many Native Americans were either forced to obey or killed, or both, depending on the circumstances. Many tribes were forced to accept payment to be removed from their lands, even though they didn't want to be removed from their lands. The chief Sitting Bull eventually fled to Canada and later returned and joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Just like a little known fact, kind of wonky there. I'd be curious to know how he felt about that, right? You could probably do a little research. So the final episode in the so-called Indian Wars occurred in 1890 at the Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota. Okay, so again, the Lakota people who were on the reservation, they've been moved multiple times. Now they're on the next reservation, living peacefully, but they began performing what was called the ghost dance. And the style of this dance kind of implied that like a messiah or a leader was going to come and kind of lead them up out of where they were. And so settlers began to fear another uprising, and the U.S. cavalry was sent in to round up these ghost dancers. Now, in this process, somebody accidentally fired their firearm, and this led to a massacre at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, where between 150 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children are killed. And I find it disturbing enough that we don't know, was it 150 or 300? One of those numbers is double the other. And it was so hidden, covered up, and swept under the rug, we don't even know for sure. And so this ultimately series of events led to the end of the Indian Wars. The U.S. government began to seek alternatives to treaties and battles. This wasn't working. They began to look for a new approach and policy to the quote Indian problem, which is where we get Americanization. This is the second part of our lesson today, Americanization. If we can't remove these Native American people and keep them in one place, let's turn them American. And so we see the beginning of the U.S. government approaching Native American relations with the goal of assimilating them into mainstream American culture. This was not a good thing for Native Americans. We'll talk about this more as we move forward. It involved education, land allotment, cultural suppression. Take away what makes them Native American and make them more like, for lack of a better term, white European American settlers. And kind of force them to become more mainstream. One of the more horrible things that I think happened during Americanization was boarding schools for Native American children. They were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools. Native American children were dressed like white Americans, forbidden to speak their native tongues, forbidden to practice traditional customs. So they were forced to be American. They even had the slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the man." So you can imagine how this policy affected Native American identity and culture. The whole point was to wipe away their identity and culture. If you were a boy, your hair had to be cut short. If you were a girl, you had to wear a dress. You had to grow your hair out. You had to speak English. And if you didn't know English, you just didn't talk until you learned. You were not allowed to communicate with the other children in your native language. You could be punished for that. The Christian religion and Protestantism forced down the throats of these children, along with American customs and American ways of living, like having allotted land and farming rather than hunting or being more like of nomadic gatherers like many Native American tribes were. So among many, many other things, a lot of Native American culture was lost during this time. And remember, this was not a choice. They were removed from their families forcibly. The Dawes Act in 1887 continued this policy of Native Americans with the goal of breaking up tribal lands into individual allotments, right? The goal was to encourage farming and, quote, civilize Native Americans by making them live like other American settlers. It also took away 2/3 of the land that Native Americans had, which had already been reduced, and opened this, quote, surplus land to white settlers, which the U.S. government, for the most part, sold off and made money off of. What were the long-term consequences of this? Well, just to start, a breaking up of the Native American way of life. So this is just the beginning of systemic taking apart of Native American culture, and we'll continue to talk about this as we move forward. So, in conclusion, United States policies drastically changed the Native American way of life. It resulted in loss of land, culture, and many, many lives, and the effects are still felt in Native American communities today, where many Native Americans are doing all they can to remember and bring back the parts of their culture that was suppressed by the US government. All right, so that concludes today's lesson.